Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a real escape this round as I put Eddie Romero's Black Mama, White Mama against Kevin Hooks' Fled. Both of these films are a remake of the 1958 film by Stanley Kramer called The Defiant Ones, and it was an early attempt for Stanley Kramer to do a film about race relations, and it starred Sidney Poitier and Tony Curtis as two convicts that end up chained together, and then they end up escaping from their chain gang and they being on the run and dealing with that stuff because, like, also, Tony Curtis is racist, and that was kind of the trope of the era of the 50s and early 60s, where they would put, like, whoever was racist against whatever ethnicity or religion or whatever, like, shit that was intolerant at that time, they would always pair them with that. They would always have to go through, like, extraordinary life-changing situations where usually the racist would end up being saved by whoever the fuck he was racist against, whether it be a black man, a Mexican, or a Jewish person, or it's endless, the amount of ethnicities, and even later on in the cinema, it went on to, like, homosexuals and even trans people. But in the first one, we have Black Mama, White Mama, directed by Eddie Romero. This is, like, by the time this movie came out, this was like a real big subgenre of exploitation films, or the women in prison genre, especially those that were made in the Philippines. This is something that Roger Corman started with The Big Dollhouse in an attempt to make, very low budget films seem like, that they had a lot bigger budgets and stuff. And it, employed a lot of these directors, including Eddie Romero and, like, Asirio Santiago and Gerardo De Leon. And but with Eddie Romero was one of the best directors of the Philippines. I'd rank him right up there with Lino Brocka. He started out making, like, really cheesy horror flicks, and then, kind of graduated into making gritty horror or gritty war films. And somehow that pairs well with this, women in prison remake of The Defiant Ones, starring Pam Grier and Margaret Markov. And, the film, the title, for the longest time when I was a kid, I always thought, Black Mama, White Mama was about an interracial lesbian couple. But that is definitely not what the case here. There's not really, I mean, of course, it's an exploitation film in the 70s. There's lesbian, overtones and stuff. Of course, the warden is a lesbian, and she's also having a thing with the other matron, but of course, she likes a little side action. So that's pretty much where the friction starts between Pam Grier and Margaret Markov, because Pam Grier is not really down with the whole lesbian thing, and then but Margaret Markov's like, I'll do anything to get out of work, and Markov, she's the revolutionary, and that's why she's in there, and Pam Grier's character is a prostitute, but she also works for one of the biggest drug kingpins or probably the biggest drug kingpin in that area, and which is played by Vic Diaz, who definitely hams it up in the film. Probably the most low-key ham that he's ever been in a film, but he definitely stands out as one ruthless motherfucker, And of course, on top of that, you've got Sid Haig, who's is kind of, it's never really clear, like, what the fuck he's like, a kind of a criminal, like, but he gets hired by the cops to find he's somebody that definitely makes money off the poor, but is able to navigate through the poor. Like, he's banging, one of his business associates is both of his daughters, while that dude's in the other room, and, very unsettling. The movie itself, and it's exciting, because once the chase gets going, because what sets it off in motion is the revolutionaries that Margaret Markov is with end up holding up the bus to try to break her out, but in the confusion, Pam Grier and Margaret Markov are chained together, so then they have to go off running, and just the comedy that ensues with them, just being on the run, being in the truck. It's a charm bracelet, and then breaks the thing over the guy's head, and it just. And of course, there's a lot of peril on the way too. Of course, it's being an exploitation film in the 70s. There's a rape scene or two that pops up. That was how they had to to sell the movies, but that's not why this movie's great. Why this movie's great is it's like got a little bit of everything in it. There's Eddie Romero definitely knows how to balance comedy and action. Some the shootout sequences are really fucking amazing. And of course, Sid Haig kind of stands out the most in it. Some of the shit with him is just insanely funny and pretty fucked up. And that ending is just so devastatingly great. Because Pam Grier gets away, but Margaret Markov ends up killed, and like most all of Diaz's men are killed, including himself and all a bunch of most of the revolutionaries. Some of them get away, but then you got the captain who he's just standing there over all these dead bodies, and he's like, oh, I'll be a major by dinner, and he's oh, it's well deserved. It's like, it's better to win, isn't it? And it just fucking ends. Just that right there. Even the exploitation films in the '70s, which were meant to be popcorn fun, like were just fucking bleak and just devastating. But then we move forward to another, very loose remake of the Defiant Ones, Kevin Hooks' Fled, starring Lawrence Fishburne and Stephen Baldwin. Here it's a little more complex of a thing. Like the biggest like subplots in like Black Mama, White Mama are the fact that like Margaret Markov's character is trying to get guns to the revolutionaries so they can take over the fucking place, get rid of the fascist government, all the the usual revolutionary jive and shit. But here is not really any of that. It's fucking it's the Cuban mafia with drugs and shit. Stephen Baldwin's a hacker. He fucks around and hacks into the wrong fucking thing. Turns out he stole like $25 million from a Cuban gangster drug dealer guy. And so they're all chasing after him. It's got a pretty decent cast. I mean, you got Lawrence Fishburne and Stephen Baldwin, they're all right together. They got pretty decent chemistry, but all in all, like, honestly, not as good as Pam Grier and Margaret Markov. And then there's the twist of, like, Lawrence Fishburne, was actually, like, assigned to help, him by the cops and all this shit. There's so many stupid twists and turns. Like Robert John Burke, he's actually working for the drug deal. Like I said, a lot of spoilers here, but like, watch these movies before you watch these videos. And if not, like, honestly, you could probably be spared some of these so I could tell you how dumb they are. Cause like Fled really gets stupid. Even the opening, which is almost a great opening, kind of falls short. And then, the opening credit sequence is kind of great as it piggybacks, that opening scene, but everything's just kind of forced together. It's very contrived. Even Will Patton, who's usually like really great, the Georgia accent that he has in this movie is atrocious. Is like the Dennis Quaid's Cajun accent in The Big Easy. It's just like, I see what he's trying to do, but a lot of these motherfuckers are kind of just phoning it in. And of course we got Selma Hayek in here to be extremely fucking hot. Because it's like peak, coming off of Desperado. Really like, what catapulted her to stardom. And her in this film is very reminiscent of Faye Dunaway in 3 Days of the Condor. And her and Lawrence Fishburne hook up real quick. She's real quick to help these. There's not even any resistance. At least Faye Dunaway put up some resistance, but it's just all, you got the 90s like really cheesed it up a lot. You had to have some, in the same way there had to be like lesbians and rape and TNA in an exploitation film in the 70s. You always had to have like some hot chick. And a lot of homosexual like jokes and jives, between the Lawrence Fishburne and Stephen Baldwin's character, because the whole prison rape and shit, and Stephen Baldwin is like harassed at the beginning of the film by one of the like the prison queens, really just trying to like fuck Stephen Baldwin and shit. So like that shit's played up a lot. It's kind of par for the course for the 90s. So really Fled is like the 90s equivalent of an exploitation film. Really just something you can just put on cable late at night and think it's good, and everything kind of works out. It's just a fucking lame ass cartoon. So I mean, this round clearly has to go to Black Mama, White Mama. I mean, first of all, Pam Grier is the motherfucking queen, the godmother of them all. Nobody can fuck with her. Might not be the greatest actor in the world, but one of the greatest screen presences. She just commands the screen, even when she's on. No matter how shitty the movie is, how shitty the dialogue is, she just has this intensity to her. There's power, this commanding presence that, nobody can really fuck with. And Margaret Markov holds her own, and, the film is like, it's not as heavy handed as like, Fled is, but even Fled doesn't really like touch on the race issues and shit. And, it's a weird thing with the Filipino directors. They always like they kind of made American movies, but in the Philippines, and but they much like the Italians with the westerns and other genre films, they kind of borrowed from the Americans. It's they usually did a way better job at making this kind of shit, and so if anybody's keeping score, it's now 24-24. The 70s have tied it up again. Like I said, even their exploitation films were fucking great, because like the movies is way more exciting. Because once Lawrence Fishburne's revealed as the fucking cop in Fledge, it's like, give me a break, no Carter. What the fuck is this shit? How many fucking times have I seen that in a fucking movie? Whereas like Black Mama, White Mama, it kind of takes shit to a whole other level, especially for exploitation films this kind of exploitation film that had been made to death, even in the short span of time that it was going popular for a while. So 24-24, we're all tied up. The next main event is Pretty Maids on a Row versus Wild Things. So we'll see where that tiebreaker goes, and who knows, I may do a bonus in between there. So it's anybody's game at this point, but we still got a long stretch to go. And like I said, if you have any suggestions, I'll try to move them up to the top. Any collaborations and that you want to debate any of this shit, because some of these, I don't like them to be longer than 15 minutes, because who the fuck wants to listen to me talk for rattle ass along about some bull this and that shit. I'd rather have a discussion, because there's a lot of layers to this shit. Not just these films, but most of the other films I've talked about that have way more shit to fucking dive into and shit. So, and anything you disagree with anything, eviscerate me in the comments. I don't really care if this is a rough draft to a doctoral thesis, and I'll listen to anything you say, even if you're wrong. But straight up sizzling. Summer's almost over, but this thing's only heating up.